The question of where the New Testament came from is an extremely important one. It's where we get our knowledge of who Jesus is, why he came, and why it should matter to us. And as part of the Bible, it claims authority over every part of our lives. But if we're to accept it as our authority, then it's fair to ask how the 27 books of the New Testament were compiled and who wrote the contents. The way we're going to approach this will be like we're following footprints. Our starting point will be the end of the footprints, the point at which the New Testament books were made into an official list. Then we'll trace the footprints back to where they began and see how close they get to the events they record and who recorded them. The books making up the New Testament were officially named at the councils of Carthage and Hippo in 393 and 397. The reason these books made the list is that they met certain criteria. First, the books had to have been written during the time the apostles were still alive. Second, the books had to have been written by an apostle or by an associate who preserved an apostle's teachings. The only exceptions are James and Jude, brothers of Jesus, who became his followers after his death. Third, the books had to have been generally accepted by the church and been used in worship services continuously since they were written. Fourth, the teaching of the books had to cohere and agree with accepted and undisputed Scripture. Fifth, the books must be inspired by God. As such, they must display a self-evidencing quality and the power to transform lives. The books meeting the criteria form what is called the canon of the New Testament because all teaching had to bow to its authority. Canon is a Greek word meaning rule or measure. Now let's start moving backwards. The oldest list we have, containing all 27 books and only these 27 books, comes from a letter written in 367 AD by Athanasius, Bishop of Alexandria. In 325, church historian Eusebius published a history of the church which included information about the books that were being used as scripture. He relied heavily on the writings of the church fathers because they quoted so heavily from the writings they considered authoritative. Following the importance given to certain writings and the criteria of the canon, Eusebius divided the books into 4 categories: canonical, widely accepted, rejected, and heretical. The canonical books were books whose authorship and authority had rarely been in question. Eusebius counted 22 books in that category, including the 4 Gospels, Acts, the 14 letters of Paul, including Hebrews, 1 John, 1 Peter, and Revelation, though he notes that there were some who doubted John's authorship. The books that were widely accepted but still debated were James, Jude, 2 Peter, 2 John, and 3 John. This accounts for all the books that make up the New Testament. There were several books that had the appearance of Scripture that some churches use for instruction and worship, yet failed to be included in the New Testament. These books ultimately fell short of the canon requirements for being either forgeries or non-apostolic. Eusebius mentions 5 of them, including the Acts of Paul, the letter of Barnabas, the Shepherd of Hermas, the Didache, or the teaching of the 12 apostles, and the Apocalypse of Peter. Although Eusebius doesn't try to list all the heretical writings he knew of, he does mention the Gospels of Thomas, Peter, Matthias, and the Acts of Andrew and John. He also rejects any gospel except the 4 accepted ones and any other works claiming to document the life of an apostle. 2 good examples of the authority the church fathers gave to the books of the New Testament are Origen and Tertullian. Around 230 AD, Origen quoted almost 18,000 times from the New Testament in his writings. He also notes that the Gospels, Acts, Paul's 13 letters, 1 Peter, 1 John, and Revelation were universally accepted, and that the other 6 books were widely accepted. And writing around AD 200, Tertullian quoted over 7,000 times from 23 of the 27 New Testament books. In total, the Church Fathers quoted from the 27 New Testament books over 36,000 times. In fact, all but 11 verses of the New Testament can be reconstructed using only quotes from the Church Fathers. Somewhere around 180 to 200, the oldest known list of books in the New Testament canon was compiled. The Muratorian canon, as it has come to be known, includes 23 books: the Gospels, Acts, the 13 letters of Paul, not counting Hebrews, Jude, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, and Revelation. However, the question of what was and was not Scripture really began in earnest around AD 140. The question arose because of an influential heretic named Marcion. Marcion thought the Old Testament and the New Testament revealed two different gods. Marcion created a canon of Scripture that completely excluded the Old Testament and included 10 of Paul's letters and the Gospel of Luke. But even these were edited to remove elements of Judaism and any hint of the Old Testament. Marcion tried to justify his edits by claiming that apostolic preaching about Jesus was a distortion. As early as AD 115, Ignatius, Bishop of Antioch, referred to the Gospel as an authoritative writing. The Gospel contained the 4 canonical Gospels and circulated as a unit bound together as a codex, like a book and not on separate scrolls. About the same time, Paul's letters, and later Hebrews, were collected into a single codex called the Apostle. Later, a third collection contained Acts and the letters of Peter, James, John, and Jude. One of the more striking attestations of the authority and origin of the Gospels is in a writing of Irenaeus. Irenaeus was a student of Polycarp, the bishop of Smyrna, who was personally taught by some of the apostles. Irenaeus passed on the history of the Gospels that he learned from Polycarp. According to Irenaeus, Matthew wrote his Gospel first, Mark wrote down Peter's teachings, Luke wrote down Paul's teachings, and John wrote his last. This history was corroborated around AD 100 to 107 by Papias, a friend of Polycarp's. Papias was a hearer of John and even a disciple of his, and claimed to know many of John's intimate friends. There is some question as to whether he's referring to the Apostle John or John the Elder, but either way, Papias claims at the very least to get his knowledge from the disciples of the apostles. Papias wrote that John taught that Mark wrote down Peter's teachings and that Matthew wrote his gospel. Clement, the bishop of Rome, wrote a letter to the Corinthians around AD 95 that quoted from 10 different New Testament books. According to Eusebius, Clement also records that the teachings of Peter were written down by his follower Mark, and that when Peter learned of the writing, he approved of it. It should be noted that most contemporary scholars don't agree with the ancient history of Matthew. The majority opinion is that Mark was written first, and that Matthew relied on Mark's account when he wrote his gospel. This is because the two Gospels share many exact or near-exact wordings of the same accounts, and where they differ in their treatments of the same event, Matthew is generally the more extensive and detailed account. Interestingly, this reliance of Matthew on Mark speaks to the authority with which Mark wrote, since Mark was not an apostle like Matthew. Why would Matthew rely on Mark unless he had accurately preserved the teaching of another apostle? Also, the oldest fragments of Matthew that we have are not in Hebrew or Aramaic, as Papias and Polycarp say, but in Greek. However, the scholars who believe that Matthew was the first gospel written suggest that there was an earlier, abbreviated or more primitive version of Matthew that was written in Hebrew or Aramaic. Mark may have used this for some material when composing his gospel. Matthew then revised and expanded his account using material from Mark's gospel. One of the more interesting arguments for the authorship of the Gospels is simply who these anonymous books are credited to. John is the type of prominent person whose name we would expect to find attached to a gospel. But although Matthew was an apostle, he's not one of the more prominent ones. Wouldn't the book carry more weight if it were attributed to Peter or James? The fact that it bears a lesser apostle's name is itself a good reason to accept the tradition. This is even more persuasive with Mark and Luke, since they weren't apostles at all, and yet their writings were quickly considered authoritative. As we saw above, Peter knew about Mark's writings and gave them his blessing, and Paul is said to refer to Luke's gospel as my gospel.